Elon Musk's Grok AI was just given access to Sanskrit manuscripts that are over 3,000 years old, texts that describe in technical detail flying machines, machines that could travel between continents, machines that could hover without sound, machines that, according to the oldest passages, could leave the Earth's atmosphere entirely. For 3,000 years, scholars called this mythology, poetry, religious metaphor about gods who move through the heavens because that's what gods do. Grok AI did not call it mythology. It read these texts the way it would read any technical manual. It looked at the vocabulary. It looked at the measurements. It looked at the operational instructions buried inside verses that generations of scholars walked past without a second glance. And what it found is now forcing researchers to ask a question most of them are deeply uncomfortable saying out loud. What if the ancient Indians were describing something real? In this video, we're going through exactly what Grok AI found. The specific machines named in these texts, the materials nobody can identify, the propulsion system built around spinning Mercury, and one passage, just one, that Grok flagged as the strangest thing in its entire analysis. A description of the Earth, seen from far above, that should not exist in a text written thousands of years before anyone supposedly knew the Earth was round. Stay to the end, because where this goes is stranger than anything you've heard about ancient flying machines before. Let's be clear about what we're doing here and what we're not doing. We are not telling you gods flew chariots through the sky 3,000 years ago. That's the easy, dismissible version of this story, and it's not the interesting one. What we're asking is something narrower, and honestly, something stranger. Did someone, somewhere in ancient India, describe a real machine? And did later generations wrap that description in religious language because they no longer understood what they were looking at? That's the question Grok AI was set loose on. And by the end of this video, you're going to have to decide for yourself where you land. If ancient technology mysteries are the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, hit subscribe right now, because the next 30 minutes only gets stranger the deeper we go. The textual foundation. Let's start where every serious study of this subject has to start. The actual texts. The earliest reference to a Vimana, the Sanskrit word most commonly translated as flying machine or flying palace, appears in the Rig Veda. This is one of the oldest religious texts on Earth, composed somewhere between 1500 and 1200 BCE. The Rig Veda describes vehicles used by the gods to move through the sky, fast, self-propelled, untouched by the limitations of ordinary travel. For most of that text, this reads exactly like what mainstream scholars have always said it is: poetic language for divine power. Gods fly because they're gods. Nobody needs an engineering manual to explain how a god gets from one place to another. That reading holds up, right up until you get to the Ramayana. The Ramayana is one of the two great Sanskrit epics, and it introduces the Pushpaka Vimana, a flying vehicle first belonging to the demon king Ravana, later claimed by the hero Rama himself. And here's where the description stops sounding like poetry and starts sounding like a spec sheet. The Pushpaka isn't just fast or magical. The text says it can carry large numbers of passengers. It can move in any direction at will. It requires no animal, no human power, no external force to propel it. It can adjust its own altitude and its own speed. The interior is described room by room, seating areas, gardens, specific architectural features laid out with the kind of detail you'd expect from someone describing a real place they'd actually stood inside. Then there's the Mahabharata, the other great epic, and this is where things get darker. The Mahabharata doesn't just describe Vimanas as transportation. It describes them as weapons platforms, flying vehicles that carry armaments, that engage each other in the sky, that unleash attacks on cities below. Some of these passages read less like myth and more like eyewitness accounts of aerial bombardment, written by people who had no other framework to describe what they were seeing. 3 major texts, 3 different levels of specificity, and a pattern that gets harder to write off with each one. But here's the thing, none of these 3 are the text Grok AI spent the most time on. The one that actually pulled its analytical attention wasn't the famous epic everyone already knows. It was something far more obscure, something most people watching this have never heard of. The Vaimānika Śāstra. It's called the Vimmanica Shastra, and its backstory alone should make you skeptical. The manuscript was transcribed sometime between 1904 and 1923 by an Indian scholar named Pandit Subbaraya Shastri. And Shastri didn't claim he wrote it. He claimed he received it through psychic channeling, dictated to him, he said, by an ancient sage across thousands of years of silence. Let's be honest about what that origin story does to its credibility. A document produced through claimed psychic transmission in the early 20th century is not archaeological evidence of anything. If this were the whole story, there wouldn't be much of a video here, but it isn't the whole story. Here's what actually caught the attention of serious researchers, and later, Grok AI itself. The technical content of the Vimmanica Shastra bears almost no resemblance to any aviation technology that existed or was even being theorized anywhere in the world at the time Shastri produced it. This was the era of the Wright brothers. Aviation was propellers, canvas, and internal combustion. The Vimmanica Shastra describes none of that. It describes propulsion principles, material compositions, and navigational methods that don't map onto anything in early 20th century engineering. Shastri was a Sanskrit scholar. He had no formal training in aeronautics, no access to engineering literature, and by every account, no obvious way to invent what he wrote down from any source available to him. In 1974, a team of aeronautical engineers and scientists at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore sat down and formally analyzed the aircraft designs in the manuscript. Their conclusion, widely cited ever since, was blunt. The designs would not fly, not using any conventional aerodynamic principle known to modern engineering. That's usually where the story ends when people tell it. Case closed, debunked. Except the actual report doesn't end there, and this is the part almost nobody mentions. Buried in that same 1974 analysis is an acknowledgement that the specific materials described for constructing these Vimanas have properties the engineers examining them could not identify. We're not sure exactly what alloy this is. Could not match to any known substance at all. 17 distinct materials, named individually in the text, each with described properties, weight, responsiveness, behavior under heat, and pressure. Grok AI cross-referenced every one of those 17 names and property sets against modern materials science databases. Every single database entry that exists for known materials and known material combinations. 0 matches. Not approximate matches, not close, but not exact. 0. That's not proof of anything on its own, but it is a strange thing to find inside a document that supposedly came from nowhere but one man's imagination in 1910. The credentialed believer. Before we go further into what Grok actually found, you need to know about one man, because without him, this entire line of research probably would have died decades ago. Dr. V. Raghavan was not a fringe figure. He wasn't a pseudo-scientist chasing headlines. He was a Sanskrit scholar at the University of Madras, and he received the Padma Bhushan, one of India's highest civilian honours, for his contributions to Sanskrit scholarship. This was a serious academic, respected by his peers, with decades of legitimate credentials behind him. In 1974, the same year as the IISc engineering report, Dr. Raghavan stood in front of the Indian National Science Academy at their symposium on ancient Indian science, and he made an argument that most of his colleagues did not want to hear. He said the Vimana descriptions across Sanskrit literature were too specific, too technically consistent to be dismissed outright as pure invention. He argued that some form of advanced aerial knowledge may genuinely have existed in ancient India, and that what survived in these texts was that knowledge, filtered and reshaped over centuries into religious and mythological language until the original technical meaning had been buried under layers of devotional storytelling. It caused controversy. Immediately, the obvious objection came fast. Where is the evidence? No wreckage, no manufacturing sites, no mention of Indian flying machines in the historical records of any neighboring civilization that might have witnessed them. Dr. Raghavan's response to that objection is the part worth sitting with. He pointed directly at the materials described in the Vimana texts, materials that, even by the descriptions themselves, were organic, composite, lightweight, responsive to atmospheric conditions, not metal, not stone. He argued that if the construction materials were genuinely organic or rapidly biodegradable composites, there would be no reasonable expectation of finding physical remains after thousands of years, regardless of whether the technology was real. Absence of evidence, he said, is not evidence of absence. He died in 1979. He never reached consensus with his colleagues, and after his death, his specific arguments about the Vimana texts were largely set aside by mainstream Sanskrit scholarship. Not refuted, not disproven, just quietly left alone. This is exactly the kind of research that tends to disappear when the person who championed it isn't around to keep defending it. If you want to see more stories like this, legitimate scholars whose work got shelved rather than debated, drop a comment and let us know. And subscribe now, because we're about to get into the part of this analysis that Dr. Raghavan never had the tools to run himself. What Grok found in the Propulsion language. Grok AI's approach to these texts was methodical. It treated the technical passages the way it would treat any engineering document, as descriptive language, not symbolic language, and it tried to extract operational parameters from the Sanskrit, the same way you'd extract specifications from a manual. 3 findings stood out above everything else. The first is propulsion. The Vaimānika Śāstra describes a propulsion mechanism with no combustion, no burning fuel of any kind. Instead, it describes a system that works through the interaction between specific atmospheric layers and particular materials built into the craft's structure. That description doesn't match any propulsion technology that existed when the text was produced. It doesn't match anything currently in operational use today either. What it does resemble, structurally, are certain non-conventional propulsion concepts that physicists have explored only in the last few decades, including electro-hydrodynamic propulsion and some theoretical frameworks around zero-point energy interactions. Now, and this matters, a structural resemblance between an old text and a modern theoretical concept is not evidence the old text is describing that concept correctly. It could easily be coincidence. Vague enough language can be made to resemble almost anything if you're motivated to find the resemblance. What Grok flagged as genuinely notable wasn't the resemblance itself. It was the specificity of the Sanskrit terminology used. The text uses distinct, separate technical terms, for different components, different materials, and different operational modes. The kind of vocabulary you'd expect from someone describing several distinct real things, not someone reaching for poetic variety to describe one vague concept of flight. The second finding is navigation. The text describes Vimana navigation, using language that translates roughly to sensitivity toward specific cosmic energies or atmospheric electrical conditions. Grok's analysis flagged this as potentially consistent with navigation using the Earth's magnetic field, a concept with no established presence anywhere in ancient Indian astronomical or scientific literature by any standard historical account. And yet here it is, described with a level of specificity that doesn't read like a lucky guess. The third finding is the one researchers found most compelling, and it's the simplest to explain. Most ancient descriptions of divine vehicles have no limitations. Gods fly wherever they want, whenever they want, with no constraints, because that's the entire point of being a god. The Vaimānika Śāstra doesn't do that. It specifies operational limits, conditions under which the craft cannot function, altitude ceilings, seasonal variation in performance. That's not how you write about a magic throne. That's how you write an engineering document about a machine that has genuine, specific constraints, because real machines always have constraints, and imaginary ones almost never do. The Mercury vortex engine. Of everything in the Vaimānika Śāstra, one description has pulled in more attention from engineers and physicists than anything else. The text's own name for it translates to something like the Mercury vortex engine. Here's what it describes. Mercury, heated, made to spin in a specific circular pattern inside a sealed container. The text gives operational detail, the direction of the spin, the required temperature, the geometric shape of the container itself. It then claims this spinning Mercury generates a force capable of producing upward thrust. Why does this description get taken seriously at all, instead of dismissed instantly like 100 other mythological flourishes? Because gods don't need engines. A divine being flies because it's divine. There's no reason for a religious narrative to specify heating temperatures and spin direction for a god's chariot. That level of operational detail belongs in a manual, not a myth. Someone writing pure fiction about a magical flying throne has no narrative reason to include a temperature specification. When Grok AI compared this passage against known physics, it found something worth sitting with. Spinning Mercury, under certain conditions, does produce measurable electromagnetic effects. This isn't speculative. It's documented, replicated, uncontroversial modern physics. What the text claims beyond that the resulting effect produces enough upward thrust to lift a vehicle, has never been demonstrated and may directly conflict with what we currently understand about physics. Let's be clear about that limitation. This is not a working engine. Nobody has built one. Nobody has made Mercury lift anything using this method. But identifying Mercury's spin behavior as electromagnetically unusual, as something worth building a system around, is not an obvious observation. It wasn't well understood in mainstream science in the early 1900s when Shastri was supposedly writing this down. So the real question Grok's analysis surfaces isn't, could a Mercury vortex engine actually fly? The physics doesn't support that claim, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. The real question is narrower and harder to dismiss. How did a document from this period come to associate Mercury specifically, not gold, not iron, not any of a dozen other materials, with unusual electromagnetic behavior, decades before that behavior was well characterized in the physics literature that existed anywhere in the world? That knowledge came from somewhere. where is the part nobody has a clean answer for? The passages that go beyond Earth. This next section is, according to Grok's own analysis, the single most anomalous finding in the entire study. So slow down for this one. The Mahabharata contains passages describing Vimanas traveling beyond Earth's atmosphere entirely. Mainstream Sanskrit scholarship reads these as purely cosmological, mythological journeys between divine realms with no physical meaning whatsoever. Gods and heroes traveling between symbolic planes of existence. That reading is reasonable for most of this material. Cosmological travel between heavenly realms is an extremely common feature of ancient religious literature across nearly every civilization on Earth. But Grok flagged specific lines where the language shifts. It stops sounding cosmological and starts sounding observational. There's a passage describing how the color of the sky changes as altitude increases. Another referencing the increasing difficulty of breathing the higher the craft travels. And then there's the passage that stopped Grok's analysis cold, a description of the Earth itself, viewed from a great distance, appearing round and bounded. Sit with that for a second. The Earth appearing round and bounded, when viewed from high enough above it. That is a correct, specific, observational fact about our planet. It is also not something you'd expect appearing casually inside a mythological narrative about divine chariots crossing cosmic realms, because a purely invented myth has no reason to get an observational detail like this correct. Myths don't need accuracy, they need drama. A writer inventing a story about gods flying to heaven doesn't need to know, or care, what the Earth actually looks like from altitude, because nobody in their audience could ever check. And yet here it is, specific, correct. Sitting inside a passage everyone assumed was pure symbolism. The spherical Earth wasn't unknown in the ancient world. Some Greek philosophers worked it out through observation and mathematics. But that knowledge wasn't universal, and by the historical record we have, it wasn't present in Indian astronomical texts of the same era in anything like this detailed, descriptive form. So how does a passage that mainstream scholarship has always read as purely symbolic celestial travel contain a specific, accurate observational detail that shouldn't be there if the passage is invented from nothing? Grok didn't answer that question. Nobody has. It just flagged it and called it the hardest single detail in the entire analysis to explain away. The silence in the ground. Every version of this conversation eventually runs into the same wall. Where's the physical evidence? If ancient India built flying machines, where are the engines, the manufacturing sites, the metal components that should have survived thousands of years buried in the ground, the way bronze tools and iron weapons from the same era have survived? This objection is powerful for most ancient advanced technology claims, and it should be. It's the reason most fringe theories fall apart the moment you ask a follow-up question. For the Vaimānika question specifically, Grok's analysis surfaced a reason this objection might be weaker than it first appears. Go back to those 17 unidentified materials from the Vimmanica Shastra. Almost every one of them is described as organic or composite, plant-based resins, mineral combinations, materials explicitly described as lightweight and reactive to atmospheric conditions. With maybe one or two exceptions, none of the specified construction materials would be expected to survive in the archaeological record for thousands of years under any normal preservation conditions. No metal artifact to dig up, no stone foundation to uncover. Organic composites decompose. That's just what they do. Now, to be completely honest with you, this does not prove Vimanas were real. It proves something narrower and much less exciting. that the absence of physical evidence is exactly what you'd expect, whether these texts describe genuine ancient technology or pure invented mythology. Both possibilities produce the identical archaeological silence, which means that silence, on its own, can't settle the question in either direction. It's ambiguous, not a debunking, not a confirmation, just genuinely unresolved. The question nobody wants to ask. So where does this actually leave us? If even a small fraction of what these texts describe corresponds to real technological knowledge that once existed in ancient India, that raises an uncomfortable follow-up question. Where did that knowledge come from, and why did it disappear so completely? No physical trace, no continuation into later Indian engineering, no parallel development showing up in any neighboring civilization's own historical record. We know ancient Indian civilization was sophisticated in ways that are well documented and not remotely controversial. Sanskrit mathematical texts contain early formulations involving the value of pi, early algebraic concepts, and astronomical calculations of genuine precision for their era. The grammatical and philosophical achievements of Sanskrit literature are respected across every serious field that studies them. It is not some wild leap to say this civilization may have developed forms of technical knowledge in specific domains that simply didn't survive physically into the present. What Grok AI cannot tell you, what no AI analysis of ancient texts can tell you, is whether the technical specificity found across these Vimana manuscripts reflects genuine transmitted knowledge, extraordinarily disciplined ancient imagination, or something sitting uncomfortably between the two. The text reads like engineering thought. Whether that engineering thought describes machines that once actually flew, or machines that only ever existed on the page, is a question the texts themselves are never going to answer for us. Here's what we do know. Some of the most technically detailed Vimana manuscripts in existence have still never been digitized. They sit in Indian university archives, read occasionally by Sanskrit specialists, but never yet subjected to the kind of cross-disciplinary computational analysis Grok just ran on the texts that are available. When those manuscripts finally do get digitized, and that process is accelerating every year, we're going to have this exact conversation again. Except next time, an AI won't be the only one asking the question. We'll be here when it does. Subscribe so you're here too.